Hi, I'm Liv, and welcome back to the Book Nook. Hey guys, so I'm still full of cold. I say I'm still full of cold. I literally have only just finished filming the last video that went up. I'm not even bothering pretending. I'm not going to get changed. So this is my March wrap-up video. Not sure why that took so long to come out of my mouth. That's what she said. So let's get cracking on the books I read in March. So first up, we have Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. Now this is a fantasy story inspired by sort of like pre-Columbian Americas. And the magic systems in this are really cool. There's stuff to do with like feathers and birds and stuff. So it was kind of like an unintended accidental bit of Norse influence in there for me, but I know that's not actually where it came from. That's just me taking what I want. And it had some good ideas, and it was nice enough as I was reading it, but what I'm realising more and more as I'm trying to talk about it is that it was kind of forgettable. It felt like it just kind of didn't reach its full potential. The characters were quite cool, and I think there's going to be a second one, and I'm kind of intrigued to see what happens next, but if there is a follow-up, it's not going to be one that I'm going to be rushing to get to. So I would say if you like your fantasy, your Sarah J Maas's, your things like that, you'll probably like this, but for me, a little bit forgettable. Next up, a graphic novel that my dear friend Dave had been telling me about, and that is Die by Kieran Gillen. He is one of the writers on The Wicked and the Divine, which I've read the first one of, and not sure if I'll go back to it. And kind of the same with this one. It's a really cool concept. It's sort of playing with the dice, the polyhedral dice that are used in D&D, and there's actually an RPG game, sorry, it's all reflective, it's no good. Kieran Gillen has actually also created and released the kind of rule set for the game that is played in the graphic novel. So in the graphic novel, this group of teenagers meet to play this game when they're teenagers. They're kind of transported into the game, into this kind of fantasy world. Shit goes wrong. One of them doesn't come back. I think one of them comes back without an arm. They're all traumatized and things like that. Years later, the D20 from the game turns up and these guys get thrust back into the game and shenanigans ensue. So it's a really cool concept, and it is really cool and really intriguing that the actual game system from the graphic novels Kieran Gillen has also created and released, and it's definitely something that I'm going to look at, and just sounds like a really cool concept. And the art was cool, but something about it just didn't stick and just didn't fully land for me. I don't know why. I think I will pick up the next couple of volumes and see where it goes, but if after the next 1 or 2 volumes it's still not really hitting me, then there'll probably be ones that flitter off my shelves elsewhere and that I don't return to. Then I read The Last Day by Andrew Hunter Murray. Now, Andrew Hunter Murray is one of the QI elves and is one of the guys on the No Such Thing as a Fish podcast, which is just one of my all-time favourite podcasts. I've mentioned before, No Such Thing as a Fish got me through some tricky times in my life. So Andrew Hunter Murray feels like a friend. He's not. I've never met him. He doesn't know who I am. Anyway, he's also one of the cast of Ostentatious, which I was lucky to see pre-lockdown, and very, very funny. If you ever get a chance to see Ostentatious, it's improv Jane Austen comedy, and it's really fun. This is probably not news to you. So in The Last Day, the world has stopped turning, and one half of the world is in total darkness and it's freezing cold, and the other half is in boiling sun and hot and heat. And in the middle is where stuff survives, and it's about one woman who is out on like a rig doing experiments and stuff like this, and this guy from her past dies, and he's dying and she's summoned, and there's all sorts of secrets about what's going on in these two halves of the world that are unsurvivable. Now again, another really cool concept is possibly not quite, the book didn't turn out to be quite as I felt it was sold, as it were. It felt like it was going to be a little bit more dystopian and exploring these two halves of the world, whereas really it kind of, all of the narrative just happens in that sliver in the middle, which, yeah, makes sense because that's where shit lives, but it just kind of felt like the stuff that was going on these two outsides of the world that are, you know, too hot or too cold wasn't really touched on, and I kind of felt that was a little bit more sold in the blurb. But it was solid, it was readable enough, nothing kind of mind-blowing, but the characters were good, nice easy read. Would recommend if you're just looking for something that's a bit sciencey, that will just transport you, and nice enough. I always struggle to decide what books are hardest to review. Is it books that I love, books that I hate, or books that I meh? With books that I love, I can often go over-enthuse and not actually dig into the content because kind of my love for them overrides them. Books that I hate can end up just being way too critical, and I just go for it. I remember writing an essay at uni about a play that I'd seen that I thought was utter dog shit, and my first draft, the lecturer said notes saying, like, there's bones of a good essay in here, but, like, rein it in a little bit. Whereas books that are meh, I just kind of struggle to say anything either way. Look at me expounding new concepts that nobody has ever thought of before. Next up, I read From the Wreck by Jane Rawson. Now, this is a book that I know Simon Savage absolutely loves. He even loves it so much that he's on the bloody cover. And this is a book that I've been putting off reading for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because I know that Simon loved it, and it's kind of set all to do with like a boat and a wreck, funnily enough. And it's a little bit magic-y and weirdy. And also because it's a book that it came out in Australia before it came out over here. And it was a book that while my dad was out in Australia, he picked me a copy of and posted it home. So this is kind of, I've got a few books from Australia that my dad, bless him, there were some books that I knew had come out in Australia that weren't coming out here for a while, that while he was out there, 3 years ago, I asked him to, if he could find copies, and I thought he'd maybe bring them home with him, but he actually just posted them as and when he found them. So yeah, kind of a weird kind of emotional reason to not want to get round to that one. I don't know, bit of a block. But I read it and I liked it. Sorry, Simon. I just think it's not entirely for me. I know Simon has spoken about problems with books on boats or books set on water before, and I never really realised that was a kind of a genre that I had a problem with, but apparently it is. And there've been a few that I've kind of that have bucked that trend. I'm thinking of River Solomon's The Deep, but I just kind of liked it. It was alright. Next up, I read Detransition Baby by Tori Peters. Now, first things first, if you have any problems with it being on the Women's Prize long list, shut the door on your way out. Goodbye. So this is about 3 people and looking at new ways of parenting and looking at transitioning and detransitioning from being transgender. And I'd heard loads of really, really good things about it, and it is undoubtedly an important book and it's really interesting. But for me, as a novel, I didn't 100% love it. I just felt that there were some ideas in there that weren't woven into the narrative structure quite as organically, and some bits of it felt like there were some gems of some really interesting essays that I'd want to read, or, sort of more narrative long-form essays that I would love to get my teeth stuck into, that kind of ran away from the narrative and just kind of jolted me out of it a little bit, and I wasn't always 100% sure what was what kind of book it was trying to be. But that's just my personal opinion of the book as a novel. It didn't fully land for me, but really, really good. I would definitely recommend reading it because it's something that, it's stories that aren't told by people that don't get to tell them, and that's always incredibly important. So that was a book that I was probably expecting to love and only liked, and then I read a book that I was expecting to only like and ended up really, really loving. And that is We Begin at the End by Chris Whittaker. Now, at first glance, this is kind of just like a fairly basic, and I don't mean that in an insulting way at all, but it's a story about a town where someone was killed and then years later they're released from prison and they come back, and the sister of the person that he killed is in the town, and it's kind of a small town, America, all the ramifications of that. But I just ended up kind of inadvertently falling in love with it. The characters in there, I don't normally, and I've spoken about this before, and again, it's not new, I'm not alone in this, have problems with child narrators or child main characters, but Duchess in this, you follow her, she is the daughter of Star, who is the ex-girlfriend of the guy who killed her sister. With me so far? I don't know how to explain that very well. And it's all about her life and coping with her mother and how her mother's grief has all consumed her and the relationship between her and her ex who killed her sister. And it just becomes this, I don't know how to explain it, but it's just absolutely wonderful. I ended up crying at the end of it, and it's not actually very often that I cry actual real wet coming out my eyes tears at a book, but I did at this one and I wasn't expecting to. The only thing I wasn't a super fan of in this is that the names are so American, like to the point where you kind of feel like, is this a caricature of American names and like place names? It's so very American. Next up, I read Sky in the Deep by Adrian Young. I read this one on Kindle. Now, this is essentially enemies to lovers, but with a Viking slant. So the Viking thing was what drew me to it, the enemies to lovers thing. I was like, yeah, I do kind of like that trope. I can be here for it. And it was okay. There's another one that if you're into that kind of thing, if you're into kind of like your slightly romantic fantasies and character driven, you'll probably enjoy it. It wasn't amazing, it wasn't shit, it was just kind of okay, and it was a nice little Viking set read, and I love them. Then I read A Closed and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers. This is the second in the Wayfarer series, and I loved A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. You may remember that was a very early video, early on, back in the day, eons ago. I absolutely loved that book, and Becky Chambers has had quite a few come out since then that are in the Wayfarer series. I've read To Be Taught With Fortunate, which is kind of outside that series. But the others in the Wayfarer series, I've kind of veered away from in that weird kind of thing where I loved A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet so much that I'm worried about the others not measuring up and sullying my memories of A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, which is dumb. So I read this one. I know my mate Dave absolutely loved this one and said that he thinks this is possibly his favourite of the series. For me, I did really enjoy it. It's kind of, it follows some of the characters from the end of The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, and essentially it's a really interesting and really heartwarming take on what it means to be human. It is about an ex-AI who is then put into a human body and discovering what makes us human and the history of the character who helps the AI turned human, her history with AI. So it was really nice. Becky Chambers' writing is just so readable, and again, that's not an insult. I know it can sometimes be used as that term, but it's just so beautifully readable. Just really enjoyed it. Another kind of sci-fi story. If you liked Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, you'll like that one again. There is nothing new here. This book has been out for a while. Then I read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and I have discovered that the hype is real. That book, you guys, I fucking loved it. Like, again, there's not going to be any new thoughts on this book because it's been out for a while and cleverer people have said cleverer things about it than me, but I just bloody loved it. It was great. Fabulous to see bisexual representation and just lovely love stories, lovely writing, really interesting concept. Loved it. And spoiler alert, if you haven't read it and you're wanting to read it, just stop now and skip ahead for a bit. I genuinely didn't see the twist coming. I don't know whether that makes me dumb. I don't know whether, you know, it was something that was so clearly signposted and in hindsight, maybe it was. Genuinely didn't see it coming, and I genuinely, I've said genuinely too many times, it's lost all meaning. And you can ask my mum if you don't believe me, but out loud, I was sat reading, and when the twist happened, I went, oh, that never happens. Never an actual out loud reaction. So actually, this month, a book that I cried actual tears out, and a book that I actually gasped at out loud. Pretty good. Then I read Steel Crow Saga by Paul Kruger, and I mentioned in my last video that this is one that I bought and immediately read. Now this is one that I actually really enjoyed. It's sort of an Asian set inspired fantasy, and people have described it as like Pokemon meets fantasy worlds, and I can kind of see that. The magic system is really cool, undeniably. The characters are quite cool. There is some issue about whether the kind of queer representation is a little bit shoehorned and a bit obvious, but when I was reading it, I didn't kind of feel that so much. The problem I had with this one is that I read it, quite enjoyed it, immediately googled the author and found that there were some problems with him, and that's a whole thing that, I mean, I don't know whether it's worth me doing a video on it, because again, there's going to be nothing new, no new ideas. But this whole thing of it turns out that he's potentially abusive, gaslighting, all of this, and it came out after his book. So it was one of those things where I read the book, really enjoyed it, googled it to see more, found out the author's a bit of a dick, and I was like, oh, I don't really know how I feel about this now. So more thoughts to mature on that one, I think. Still percolating. Then after reading that one, it was time for spring book hibernation. So there was a list of prompts again, and I picked some books for that and went for it. So first up for the prompt was book with 5 words in the title. I read The Death of Vivek Oj by Akwaeke Emezi. Now, I loved Emezi's Pet so much, and I've seen people raving about The Death of Vivek Oj, and it was another one that I just kind of liked, didn't love. Beautiful writing, and I totally get why people loved it, but there's something I just couldn't fully connect. There was something, some reason, I don't really know, it's one of those things where you can't put your finger on it, but I just couldn't fully connect. It felt a little bit like the text was kind of keeping you at arm's length, and that may have been an intentional thing, but for me it didn't fully work. So I liked it, definitely worth reading, definitely recommend it, but it's not going to be something that I'm gonna love. Now the next prompt was a novella, and I actually ended up reading a few novellas because I was feeling like little grabby little bits. I read Open Water by Caleb Azuma Nelson. Now this has been billed as kind of like a black normal people, and I don't think that's necessarily fair, because it's its own thing. It's not always necessarily fair to kind of always compare things to these things, but I can kind of see where the comparison comes from. Now this book I ended up absolutely loving. The writing is stunning. It's this beautiful, emotive, lyrical these two black artists in London falling in love, their relationship, how it matures and changes, and their relationship to their bodies, to their blackness, and how everything intersects in society, and it's just absolutely beautiful. When I finished it, it felt like it was like a 3.5 star read, but it's kind of been, it's a grower, not a shower, I guess. It's been growing in my mind, and it's definitely nearer like a 4.5, and definitely something I'll go back to. When I feel the need to cry. Next up I read Permafrost by Ava Baltazar. Now this is another novella prompt and also got some kind of weather in the title. This is published by And Other Stories, and you guys know that I love And Other Stories. Now this book is one that I was really excited about. It's an unapologetically queer lesbian narrator, and it's basically her life and her relationships, and sort of she moves around the country trying to find what she's doing. And what I can say about this one is I think it's a book that I would have loved even more had I read it maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. But the writing in this is just gorgeous, very up my street. There's a line at the beginning, a sort of, I don't know what the word is, but like an acknowledgement thing to say to poetry for permitting it. And it's so poetic. And the notes in the back by Julia Sanchez on translation are well worth a read as well, and utterly gorgeous and really an interesting take on it. So, and other stories, always killing it. Definitely recommend this one. Next up, I read The Rain Heron by Robbie Arnott. Read that on the Kindle. There it is. Now, you guys know how much I love Flames by Robbie Arnott, so I had really, really high hopes for this one. Now, Robbie Arnott's writing is, again, it's something that I'm not very good at quantifying or putting my finger on exactly what quality it is in the writing that I love, but there's something about Robbie Arnott's writing that I just, it makes me sing. So, no issues with the writing, utterly beautiful to read. And the story maybe wasn't quite as engaging as Flames, possibly because it wasn't quite as straightforward and it was more fragmented, but the fragments kind of, they linked, but I wasn't quite sure how, and I was always waiting for connections that maybe didn't show up, and maybe that's part of the point. Maybe there were some connections that were left dangling for you to connect yourself. But again, really, really enjoyed it. Utterly beautiful. Didn't love it as much as Flames, but still very much enjoyed it and worth a read and recommend. There you go. Then another prompt for Spring Book Hibernation was a book with yellow on the cover, so I went as yellow as I could get and went with We Are Never Meeting in Real Life by Samantha Irby. Now this is a collection I've had on my shelf for ages, and I've also got on my Kindle a couple of other collections. Samantha Irby is someone who I've heard raved about before. This collection and her others are meant to be really good, and I think what happened is that I'm not as in the mood for funny essays as I maybe used to be. But these are really funny and honest and raw essays that I love that quality of just going like, this is me, give a shit. So definitely pick it up if that's something you're in the mood for, fully honest and funny and quite raw essays. But for me, I just wasn't really in the mood for it. I didn't end up finishing it and reading all of the essays. And I know that's kind of a thing with this kind of book, that you don't have to read it front to back all in one go or anything like that. But I don't think it's something I'm going to be rushing to go back to because I'm just not in that place. And finally, I technically read this one at the beginning of April, but because it was part of Spring Hibernation, I'm going to put it in with this as well, and that's Andrei Kirkov's A Matter of Death and Life, another little novella, and it kind of fits yellow on the cover, but I think that's orange, really. So I think the main thing with this one, maybe the Ukrainians, maybe that kind of literature is just not for me. I will still give Death and the Penguin a go one day, because I know lots of people say that's a very good book. Maybe it just wasn't for me. Again, it felt like the kind of book that I would have enjoyed more when I was a moody teenager, or would have felt very much like, this is amazing, back then. As it was, it took a little while to get into. I did enjoy it more as it went on, and the dark humour kind of really came into its own, I think, in the second half of the book. And yeah, just a nice way to pass an afternoon. So that's what I read in March. Feels a little bit better, a bit more positive than February. I feel like overall this year so far, there've not been as many like standout books. There's been a lot of kind of like okay books. But to be honest, as long as I'm reading stuff that I'm not hating, I'm happy. There were definitely some surprises this month in terms of books that I thought I was going to love, that I only liked, and books that I thought I was only going to like, that I ended up loving. So yeah, have a little chat with me in the comments below if you've read any of these books and have differing opinions, same opinions, just want to shoot the shit with me about any of these books, any that you haven't read, that my garbled explanations of have made you think you want to read. Explain how that happened. Just have a general chat with me in the comments below. Let me know what you've been reading. Let me know what you read in March. I don't know, just shoot the shit. That's what I'm here for. So thanks very much for watching, guys. I will see you next time. Goodbye.